When first responders rushed inside, they found the bathroom in chaos. Water was still dripping, the floor slick and wet. On the tiles lay Stacy Feldman, 44 years old, mother of two. She was dressed oddly, still wearing her watch, something no one ever forgets noticing later. Her husband stood nearby, saying he had pulled her from the shower and tried to help. But what paramedics saw was a woman whose life was slipping away, and quickly. They began the fight. Chest compressions, oxygen. Every second counted. One paramedic shouted for rhythm, another counted under his breath, pushing against her chest with the weight of his body. Hope flickered and died, flickered again, then dimmed for good. After nearly half an hour of desperate effort, a voice broke the room with finality. Time of death. The sounds of saving stopped, leaving only the drip of water echoing off porcelain. Stacy Feldman was gone. News traveled quickly. To her friends, it was unthinkable. Stacy was not fragile, not weak. She was energetic, involved, the kind of woman people depended on. A volunteer at her children's school, the organizer of community events. She gave time to others, gave love freely, and now, suddenly, she was gone? At first, the story seemed simple. People collapse in showers. Hearts give out. Tragedy doesn't ask permission. Bob Feldman, her husband, told police he had left the house earlier in the day, gone about his business, and returned home to find her in trouble. To outsiders, it fit. A terrible random accident in a suburban home. But when Stacy's body was examined, the answers weren't there. There was no clear cause of death. No sign of drowning. No proof of heart failure. Nothing that could explain why, in the prime of her life, she had collapsed. The medical examiner wrote just one word: undetermined. Not natural, not accident, not homicide. Just undetermined. For most families, that word brings confusion. For investigators, it leaves a door open. And for Stacy's friends and family, it left a haunting question that wouldn't go away. How does a woman so full of life end her story like this? From the outside, the Feldman family looked like the picture of success. A comfortable home in Denver, 2 healthy children, and a marriage that, to neighbors, seemed steady and strong. Bob worked. Stacy volunteered. They went to school events together, appeared in family photos, smiled at community gatherings. To anyone looking in, the Feldmans were proof that life in suburbia could be safe, predictable, almost enviable. But what people see, and what happens behind closed doors, are never the same. Stacy's friends had noticed subtle changes. She still showed up at school events, still put on that bright smile, but it didn't always reach her eyes. Some said she seemed distracted. Others said she seemed distant, carrying something heavy she never put into words. They couldn't say exactly what it was, only that the light around her seemed dimmer than before. Behind the walls of their home, cracks were forming. Arguments whispered down hallways, tension that grew heavier with each passing year. Bob, who appeared charming in public, didn't always seem that way in private. Stacy's friends would later say she sometimes hinted at being frustrated, sometimes sounded tired of trying to keep everything together. Still, she carried herself with dignity. She was the mother who showed up when no one else volunteered, the friend who remembered birthdays, the woman who, despite whatever battles she was fighting inside her home, gave to others as though she had nothing to lose. But the truth was this: Stacy wasn't just fighting against exhaustion or against stress. She was fighting against secrets. Secrets she hadn't shared. Secrets her husband had buried. And in the weeks before her death, the distance in her eyes grew sharper. The smiles looked harder to hold. The perfect family portrait was only that, a portrait. What it covered up was the reality of a marriage cracking apart. Would you want your story forgotten because no one spoke up? Don't let Stacy's voice die here. Subscribe, or go to the comments and tell us why her death shouldn't matter. Stacy Feldman's life looked like stability, but the truth, just beneath the surface, was waiting to break free. And the first crack would come from a phone call. A call from another woman who knew Bob's secret. Her name was Susan M.C. Bride. At first, she had no reason to doubt the man she was seeing. He was charming, funny, attentive. He told her he was available, that he was free, that he had space in his life for her. And Susan believed him. Why wouldn't she? But over time, little things didn't add up. Bob's excuses, the moments when he disappeared, the stories that sounded polished but never quite real. And then, Susan discovered the truth. The man she thought she knew wasn't single. He wasn't separated. He wasn't free at all. He was married. Married to a woman named Stacy. Susan was furious. But more than that, she was hurt. No one wants to be lied to, used, dragged into someone else's mess. And for Susan, the idea that another woman, a wife, was living in the dark while she had been deceived, it was unbearable. So she made a choice. She decided to tell Stacy the truth. On the morning of March 1st, 2015, Susan dialed Stacy's number. Imagine being on the other end of that call. A stranger's voice. A woman you've never met. And then the words, "I've been seeing your husband." Stacy listened. We may never know everything she said back. Did she cry quietly? Did she shout? Did she ask for details? Did she simply hang up? What we do know is this. That morning, Stacy Feldman's world cracked wide open. The life she thought she had, the marriage, the family, the stability, suddenly looked like a lie. And by that afternoon, she was gone. Investigators would later obsess over this timeline. What happened in the hours between that phone call and Stacy's final moments in her shower? Did she confront Bob face to face? Did she demand answers? Did she tell him she wanted a divorce? Did she threaten to expose him, to destroy the image he worked so hard to protect? Because Bob Feldman's life, on paper, looked perfect. He had respect in the community, a home, 2 children, a wife who volunteered, who supported him, who made their family appear polished and whole. But the mask was slipping, and if Stacy decided to tear it off completely, Bob stood to lose everything. For prosecutors, this was the turning point. A motive so clear, so immediate, it changed how they looked at everything. A mistress calls a wife in the morning. The wife learns the truth. Hours later, the wife is dead. That's not coincidence. That's cause and effect. But in 2015, all of that was still ahead. On that quiet March morning, there were only 2 women connected by one man. One of them alive and determined to tell the truth. The other now living in betrayal, in anger, in heartbreak. And by sunset, only one of those women would survive the day. Affairs can break marriages. They can break trust. They can break hearts. But rarely do they end like this, with a staged crime scene, a husband insisting it was an accident, and investigators staring at evidence that whispered otherwise. Stacy Feldman had discovered her husband's secret, and in less than 24 hours, she would pay the ultimate price for knowing it. When the first autopsy report came back, it didn't give the clarity everyone wanted. Cause of death, undetermined. That single word left a cloud over Stacy's case. But doctors, forensic experts, and later prosecutors would study the evidence again and again. And the more they looked, the stranger it became. The first red flag was simple. Stacy was still wearing her watch, a silver-faced wristwatch she often wore during the day. But who showers with a watch on? Friends said it was out of character. Investigators noticed it immediately. To them, it looked like something staged, as if Stacy had been moved or placed into the shower after her death, not before. Then came the bruises. Some were scattered across her arms, others across her thighs, her shoulders, her torso. At first, Bob tried to explain them away. He said they must have come from him trying CPR. He said he pulled her from the shower roughly, tried to revive her, pressed on her chest again and again. But when forensic pathologists compared the patterns, they didn't match CPR at all. They matched restraint, fingers gripping, hands pressing down. A struggle, not a rescue. And then the most telling clue. The tiny red spots in her eyes, petechiae. To most people, they're invisible. To an expert, they're unmistakable. Petechiae appear when pressure is forced on the neck or the face, cutting off circulation. They are the silent signature of suffocation, and they were found in Stacy's eyes. One pathologist would later testify that the evidence pointed not to collapse, not to accident, not even to sudden natural causes, but to asphyxia. In plain words, Stacy Feldman had been deprived of air. Piece by piece, the scene began to unravel. A woman found in her shower, but wearing a watch. A husband who said he pulled her out, but bruises that suggested she fought back. A coroner's report that couldn't commit to a cause, but microscopic signs that pointed to strangulation. This didn't look like a fall. It looked like a fight. And as the evidence stacked higher, one truth became harder to ignore. If Stacy hadn't simply collapsed, if the marks on her body were signs of violence, if the petechiae in her eyes told the story of her final moments, then someone had been in that bathroom with her. Someone had taken her last breath away. The question wasn't whether Stacy had died by accident. The question was whether her death had been staged to look like one. And if that was true, then the man who claimed to find her, the husband who dialed 911, might not have been the desperate rescuer he pretended to be, but the cause of her death itself. For most families, grief is hard enough. But grief without answers? That is something entirely different. The word written on Stacy's death certificate was short, but it carried years of pain, undetermined. Not accident, not homicide, not illness. Just undetermined. It meant no resolution, no clear cause, no one held responsible. It meant her children would grow up not even knowing how their mother died. In the days after her death, the community wrapped itself around Bob Feldman. Friends sent flowers, neighbors dropped off casseroles, teachers asked how the children were coping. To outsiders, Bob was a man struck by tragedy, left to raise his family alone. People shook his hand, hugged his shoulders, and whispered how unfair it all was. And Bob played the part well. He walked into school events with his children, accepted the sympathetic nods, spoke of Stacy with heavy sighs, as though the weight of loss was always pressing on his chest. To some, he looked broken. To others, he looked brave. He had fooled almost everyone. But while the world around him was moving on, not everyone was willing to let Stacy's story end with a single word. Forensic experts knew the case didn't sit right. The bruises, the petechiae, the inconsistencies that kept circling back. So quietly, without cameras, without headlines, they kept pulling the file back out. They ran tests again. They compared photos. They asked questions no one else wanted to ask. And with each review, the story became harder to ignore. The bruises didn't line up with CPR. The watch on her wrist wasn't something she would wear in a shower. And those red spots in her eyes, those tiny flecks that only experts notice, they weren't random. They weren't meaningless. They were signs of strangulation. Still, officially, the case was frozen in place. Bob was free to date again, free to smile in public, free to slip into the role of a grieving husband whenever it suited him. He collected sympathy like it was currency, and each year that passed, the truth seemed further out of reach. But the people who loved Stacy never forgot. Friends told each other in whispers that something wasn't right. Her family lived with the ache of knowing her story had no ending. And investigators, they couldn't shake the feeling that a killer had staged a crime scene and walked away untouched. If you're still watching, you already see how easy it is for truth to be buried. Subscribe now, or step into the comments and explain why you'd rather let killers get away. And then, the silence began to crack. Forensic experts who had been patient, who had studied the evidence again and again, began to speak louder. They pointed to the bruises. They pointed to the petechiae. They pointed to the signs of suffocation no one could explain away. Slowly, piece by piece, the case was being rebuilt. Not as a tragedy, not as an accident, but as a crime. And when the evidence finally surfaced, it didn't show a woman who collapsed in her shower. It showed a woman who fought for her life. A woman who struggled against her killer. A woman whose death had been staged to look like something it wasn't. What once looked like silence, now painted a chilling picture. A picture of deception. A picture of violence. A picture of a husband who may have been living not as a victim, but as the man responsible for ending Stacy Feldman's life. By the time the trial of Robert Feldman began, years had already passed since Stacy's death. To the outside world, the case had been forgotten, a cold story marked undetermined. But now, in a Denver courtroom, that single word was about to be rewritten. From the first day of testimony, it was clear this would not be an ordinary trial. The courtroom was packed. Family members clutched each other's hands. Friends leaned forward, desperate for answers. And at the center sat Bob Feldman. Not as the grieving husband he had once claimed to be, but as a defendant accused of first-degree murder. He looked calm, even polished, dressed in a suit and tie, his face betraying little. But beneath that calm was a man fighting for his freedom. The prosecutors opened with a promise. They would prove that Stacy Feldman's death was not an accident, not an undetermined tragedy, but a deliberate act of murder staged to look like misfortune. They told the jury they would show evidence of a struggle, of suffocation, and of a motive born from betrayal. And then, piece by piece, they began to deliver. Forensic experts were the first to take the stand. Pathologists described the bruises on Stacy's arms, on her shoulders, on her thighs. They explained how the patterns of those marks told a story not of CPR, but of resistance. Hands gripping her, holding her down. They spoke in calm, clinical voices, but their words carried the weight of violence. Then they turned to her eyes. On a large screen in front of the jury, magnified photographs revealed the petechiae, tiny red dots no bigger than pinpricks. The experts explained what they meant: a blockage of air, the result of strangulation or suffocation. It was a detail invisible to most, but undeniable to those who knew what to look for. Jurors stared at the images. Some leaned back in their seats, others leaned forward, as if trying to absorb every word. The science was clear. The marks didn't come from CPR. They didn't come from a fall in the shower. They came from pressure, someone's hands or someone's weight, robbing Stacy Feldman of air. And then came the witness who tied motive to the evidence, Susan M.C. Bride. She took the stand slowly, nervous but determined. She told the courtroom how she had met Bob Feldman, how he had charmed her, how he had lied to her, pretending to be free. And then she told them about the moment she discovered he was married. About how, on the morning of March 1st, she had picked up the phone and called Stacy directly. The silence in the courtroom was heavy as she described that conversation. She told Stacy who she was, what Bob had done, the truth that shattered the illusion of a perfect marriage. And then she told the jury the part that left everyone shaken. Hours after that call, Stacy Feldman was dead. You could feel the shift in the room. The coincidence was too sharp, the timeline too exact. A wife discovers her husband's affair in the morning. That same afternoon, she's found lifeless in her shower. Prosecutors didn't stop there. They brought out photographs of the scene. Stacy's body on the bathroom floor, the silver watch still strapped to her wrist. They asked the jury to consider, who showers with a watch on? They showed the bruises, the petechiae, the inconsistencies in Bob's story. And with each piece of evidence, the air grew heavier. Family members cried quietly in the gallery. Jurors whispered to one another during breaks. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing they were watching a story that would echo far beyond this room. And through it all, Bob sat motionless, watching as the image of a grieving husband was stripped away, replaced by the image of a man accused of staging his wife's death. The prosecution's case was clear, methodical, devastating. They argued that Bob had everything to lose if Stacy exposed him. His marriage, his reputation, his carefully built life. And so, when she discovered the truth, he silenced her. By the time the experts finished their testimony, the jury was no longer hearing about an undetermined death. They were hearing about murder. And the moment the photographs flashed on the screen, the bruises, the eyes, the watch, the courtroom itself seemed to understand. This didn't look like a fall. It didn't look like CPR. This looked like a fight. And in that instant, the narrative that had once been clouded by doubt became sharp, undeniable. This wasn't undetermined anymore. This was murder. The trial had lasted for weeks. Witness after witness had walked across the courtroom floor. Jurors had seen the photographs, heard the testimony, listened to the science, and pieced together the story of Stacy's final day. For them, it all came down to this moment. The courtroom was hushed as the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a decision. Every eye turned to the door as 12 ordinary men and women filed in. Their faces were tense, unreadable, carrying the weight of 7 years of silence. Robert Feldman sat rigid at the defense table. He wore a gray suit and a tie knotted too tightly, his hands clasped together, his jaw set. For years he had lived as a free man, claiming to be a victim of tragedy. Now, with each step of the jurors, that story was crumbling. The judge asked the question that had been hanging in the air for years. On the charge of first-degree murder, how do you find the defendant? The foreperson stood. A single sheet of paper shook slightly in their hand. Then came the word that would change everything: guilty. The room erupted in sound. Stacy's family gasped, tears breaking free as the verdict echoed. Some clutched each other, sobbing into shoulders. Others whispered prayers, gratitude tangled with grief. Friends who had waited so long for justice wept openly. For years they had lived under the shadow of uncertainty, asking themselves why Stacy was gone, how her life had ended, and whether anyone would ever be held accountable. In that single word, guilty, the uncertainty shattered. Bob Feldman didn't move. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his face as cold as stone. But the truth was clear. The mask he had worn for 7 years had finally slipped away. He was no longer the grieving widower. He was a convicted murderer. Then came sentencing. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom, deliberate and heavy with finality. Robert Feldman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No escape, no second chance, no appeal to sympathy. His life would end behind concrete walls and locked steel doors. For Stacy's family, the words felt like both a victory and a loss. Justice had been done, but the cost was unbearable. They would never hear her laugh again, never see her at the kitchen table, never watch her children grow with their mother by their side. For them, every holiday, every birthday, every milestone would be a reminder of what was stolen. The children, 2 lives forever altered, sat quietly, too young to fully grasp the weight of the sentence. But one day, they would. They would grow up knowing their father had taken their mother's life, and that the justice system had locked him away for it. Stacy's children will grow up without a mother. If you won't subscribe, at least go to the comments and explain why her story doesn't deserve to be remembered. In the gallery, reporters scribbled notes, their pens chasing the last chapter of a story that had haunted Denver for years. Some jurors wiped their eyes as they were dismissed. They had shouldered the burden of judgment, and now they carried the knowledge that their decision had given voice to a woman who could no longer speak for herself. The sound of chains clinking filled the courtroom as deputies approached the defense table. Bob Feldman stood, his wrists locked in cuffs, his shoulders slightly slumped now that the verdict had sealed his fate. For a final moment, he glanced toward the benches, scanning faces that would never forgive him. And then he was led away, down a hallway that would take him not to freedom, but to a cell where he would spend the rest of his life. For Stacy's family, it was a moment of justice. But it was also a reminder, justice doesn't bring back the dead. Justice doesn't erase the pain. It only answers the question of responsibility. And that answer was now carved into history. Robert Feldman was guilty. Stacy Feldman had been murdered. And the mask of an accident had finally been ripped away. She was a wife. She was a mother. She was a friend, a volunteer, a neighbor, a woman whose life touched many others. And now, she is a name etched into the painful history of a staged death that could have gone unseen forever. What began as a quiet Sunday afternoon in Denver ended as a lifetime of grief for her family. In one moment, the illusion of a perfect household collapsed. In one moment, trust was shattered, innocence stolen, and 2 children were left to grow up without the most important person in their lives. Robert Feldman will spend the rest of his days behind bars. For the world, his name is tied not to the life he tried to portray, but to the secret he tried to bury. A husband who killed his wife, and then attempted to disguise it as an accident. He had lived for years as a free man, collecting sympathy, masking himself in grief. But masks always slip, and when his did, what was left was not a husband mourning his wife, but a man convicted of murdering her. For Stacy's family, the verdict brought justice, but not peace. Because justice doesn't bring her back. Justice doesn't fill the empty chair at the dinner table. Justice doesn't hug children when they cry at night. Justice is only an answer, carved in stone, to a question that should never have existed. And yet, there is meaning in the truth finally revealed. Forensic science spoke when words could not. Investigators refused to stop digging. Friends refused to let her story fade. And in the end, a staged death, once hidden behind the word undetermined, was unmasked for what it truly was. It wasn't a shower accident. It wasn't a tragic collapse. It was a husband's affair, a confrontation that escalated into violence, and a desperate attempt to disguise murder as misfortune. It was staged. And no matter how carefully Bob tried to cover his tracks, the truth could not be silenced forever. When we look at Stacy's story, we're reminded of how fragile life is, how quickly trust can turn to betrayal, how easily a life that looks perfect from the outside can hold darkness within, and how important it is that voices keep speaking when systems stall, when cases sit in limbo, when killers think they've gotten away. The image that remains is not the cold scene of a shower floor, but the warmth of Stacy's smile. Her laughter, her kindness, her presence in the lives of her children and her friends. That is the picture we hold on to. That is the picture worth keeping alive. Her story can fade, or it can live here. Subscribe now, because if you don't, Stacy Feldman's name disappears with the next headline. And if you won't subscribe, then step into the comments and tell us why her voice shouldn't matter. Because in the end, this is more than a story about death. It is a story about truth. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, cannot be hidden forever.